We're very excited for you guys to be here and to join us for our webinar on navigating medical device regulations in Australia. I'm Gay Esther, the marketing manager here at RegDesk. And if you aren't familiar with RegDesk, we're an AI-powered regulatory information management platform with built-in regulatory intelligence. Our platform allows RA teams to leverage AI to prepare, manage, and publish international submissions smarter and faster. If you want to learn more or have specific questions or anything you'd like to discuss with us, you can feel free to reach out. My information will be in the slide deck at the end of this, so we'll send that out to you and you'll be able to follow up with me via email. And if you'd like to schedule a demo, I have a team that can do that for you as well if you want to see our platform in action. To focus on you for a minute, I just want to let you know we truly do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today. And we would love for you to participate and ask questions. So just drop questions in as we go through the webinar. We'll take 5 to 10 minutes at the end to answer those questions. So just go ahead and drop them along the way, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. If we run out of time, we do want to be cognizant of your time schedule. So we'll stop the webinar at 10, but then we'll make sure we follow up and answer any questions if you have outstanding questions. Also, too, we love sharing information with you like this webinar. So if you want to see something specific or you have a topic that you'd love to see from us or read about in our blog or see on LinkedIn, then just shoot me an email too, and I'll be happy to try to add that into our schedule so we can cover topics that are truly important to you. After this webinar, you will get the slide deck and recording, so be on the lookout for that by the end of the week. So today we're excited to dive into the Australian regulatory landscape with our expert Lee Westwood. He is the founder and principal consultant at QRA Consulting Proprietary Limited. Lee brings nearly 20 years of experience in regulatory affairs, quality assurance, and clinical data management. He's a trusted subject matter in medical devices and IVDs, and he assists global manufacturers with global regulatory strategies, EU IVDR and MDR compliance, APAC and America's regulatory requirements, and TGA sponsor services in the Australian market. Whether you're planning to enter the Australian market or you want to strengthen your compliance, today's webinar is just going to provide you tons of value. So we're super excited for the webinar. We're glad for you to attend this today. And without further ado, Lee, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get started.
Excellent, thank you. Hopefully now I should be sharing my screen.
Yep, I can see it. Thank you.
Perfect. So yeah, thank you. Thank you, Gay, and thanks RegDesk for putting together this webinar today and giving me the opportunity to talk to you all. I think we're all appreciative for companies like RegDesk and this day and age when the regulatory framework and landscape around the world is continuously changing, and it's very difficult to keep up to date with everything that's going on globally. So grateful for companies like RegDesk and very grateful to be talking to you tonight. So, like we said, we're going to be navigating the medical device regulations in Australia tonight. And it is tonight for me. It's 10 p.m. my time. I am based here in Western Australia. So I've been drinking a lot of coffee today to make sure I'm still alert and able to give you this presentation today. So I am based in Western Australia now, but I'm sure many of you can hear from my accent that I'm not an Australian native. I was born and raised in Scotland, the UK, and I moved to Australia, when I was 29, some 15 years ago. But I'm a dual national now. I have an Australian passport, and I have my sons were born here, so I do consider myself very much Australian. But my accent, I will try and talk somewhat slowly so you can understand me. My friends back home in Scotland like to joke that I do have a bit of an Australian twang that's creeped into my accent, so forgive me for that. So they've already gone over much of what my company does. Like I said, my name is Lee Westwood, and I think the key takeaway from this slide and the services that I offer is the TGA sponsor services. So that's something that's going to be very applicable to the conversation that we're having tonight, or today, this morning for many of you, and this afternoon for many of you as well. That's my email address at the bottom left of that slide. It's lwestwood@QRA Consulting. If we don't get to your questions today, or you have any questions about any of the other services listed on this slide, feel free to reach out to me or reach out to RegDesk or look for me on LinkedIn. Okay, so today I'm going to give you guys an overview of the Australian medical device regulations. Now, I'm not privy to everyone who's attending this, so I'm sure there's many people here who are familiar with the medical device regulations, and I'm sure there's some that's not very up to speed with these regulations. So I'm going to give you a high-level overview. I mean, to be honest, this webinar could have been 3 hours long with the amount of information that's available and the amount of exciting and important changes that are happening with the regulations. But to keep it concise, I've went relatively high level. If you want more details, of course, please reach out to me or RegDesk. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the regulations, and then we're going to look at the approval process for market authorization. So how do you get your medical device in IVD approved for marketing in Australia? What does the process look like? We're going to talk about the role of the Australian sponsor. This is an important feature in applying for medical device inclusion, particularly if you're an overseas manufacturer. We're going to look at that. I'm going to describe manufacturer's evidence, which is part of the inclusion application. I'll describe what type of manufacturer's evidence you need to provide. And we'll look at regulatory strategy. So leveraging overseas approvals, something that the TGA does, which is very beneficial to manufacturers and sponsors alike. I'm going to touch on the TGA Conformity Assessment Certificate. I'm not going to go into great detail on that today, and I'll explain why when we get to that point in the presentation, but I will touch upon it. We're going to look briefly at the clinical evidence requirements for your medical devices and IVDs with the TGA. Looking at the levels of evidence, the regulations that guide the evidence that you must present, and also likewise the similarities between the evidence in Australia and that of the European regulations in particular. And we're going to look at the impact of the MDR and the IVDR and the impact that has had on the regulations in Australia, but also the impact it's had on manufacturers who have devices already approved in Australia or are looking to apply to get their devices on the market in Australia. It's quite interesting. And then I have a couple of slides to discuss the running of clinical trials in Australia, because under certain circumstances you may need to do that. There's also some benefits to running trials here. And some disadvantages, it has to be said. So we will look into that as we go through. So an overview of the medical device regulations in Australia. So the responsibility falls to the Therapeutic Goods Association. That's the TGA. I'm sure most of you have heard of the TGA. They are part of the Australian Government Department of Health and are the regulatory authority in Australia. And they're responsible for all therapeutic goods. Now, therapeutic goods ranges from medicines, medical devices and IVDs, blood products, and everything in between. Now, the Australian market for medical devices and IVDs is actually a very strong market. The latest publication I read, I believe that the Australian medical device market is forecasted to achieve approximately a revenue of around 7.5 billion Australian dollars in 2025, and they're expecting a steady annual growth over the next few years. We're seeing a lot of innovation and growth in the medtech industry in Australia. So there's funding from governments and investors, and there's a lot of innovative products coming out of Australia. So there really is a strong market, and I think one of the appealing aspects of getting devices on the market in Australia is the use of overseas market authorizations to abridge or facilitate expedited reviews in Australia. And also the TGA, I find to be a very accommodating regulatory authority. I've worked with a few regulatory authorities around the world, and sometimes trying to get information can be like getting blood from a stone. But the TGA, they provide a lot of guidance. They provide a lot of opportunities for consult in terms of reforms and the like, and they get back to you quite quickly in email. So this does kind of bring together a perfect storm of a very strong market and an appealing market for manufacturers. Okay, so if you want to supply a medical device, and medical device means medical device and IVD in Australia, you have to comply to the Therapeutic Goods Medical Device Regulations of 2002 and the Therapeutic Goods Act of 1989. Now, the way to think about this is the Therapeutic Goods Act is the overarching legislative framework for all therapeutic devices, whereas the Therapeutic Goods Medical Device Regulations is tailored specifically for medical devices. The clue is in the title. And by complying to the Goods Medical Devices Regulations, you're going to comply to the requirements applicable to medical devices in the Therapeutic Goods Act of 1989. Now, I think that there's some good discussion points here because one thing that I've found working both closely with the European regulations and the Australian regulations is, yes, there's a lot of alignment. I mean, you can see that the regulation is from 2002. That's some 23 years ago now. But there has been a lot of reform since then, and particularly recently to align more closely to the MDR and the IVDR in Europe. But like I was saying, working with the IVDR and MDR and the therapeutic good regulation in Australia, I find that the regulation here in Australia is more outcome based. Okay, so whereas the MDR and the IVDR is very prescriptive, it's very matter of fact, it's very you must have this, you must have that, you must have this documentation that says this, that, and this. Whereas the Australian regulations are very much okay, well, you need to conform to this essential principle. How are you going to do it? And I think that that is extremely beneficial to manufacturers, and it's something that's allowed the TGA to reform their regulations to align closely to other regulations around the world, but also, incorporate best practice from, say, the IMDRF or from the FDA, rather than completely aligning itself to one regulation. So we have seen a lot of reform in the regulation, particularly since around 2021. Again, prompted by the MDR and the IVDR in Australia. So we've seen changes in, pathways for novel devices. We've seen changes related to companion diagnostics and devices for self-test. We've seen a bit of an alignment between risk classifications, and we'll talk about that. And we've seen some more emphasis on post-market surveillance, UDIs, and some other interesting reforms that are actually on the go at the moment. Okay, so if you want to supply a medical device or an IVD, you must have an inclusion on the Australian Register for Therapeutic Goods. So that's the ARTG. This is a central database, public-facing database in Australia that anyone can do a search on. Once you get your approval from the TGA to market your device in Australia, you will be included on this register, and you'll be able to search for your device, or others will be able to search for your device through an ARTG entry ID. And the entry ID will provide you, the risk classification of your device, the manufacturer details, and the sponsor details, as well as an intended purpose. So it can cover a device or several devices. Only an Australian sponsor, this is important. So only an Australian sponsor can apply for an inclusion on the ARTG. And I'm going to talk about that in some detail today. Now, Australian manufacturers themselves can assume the role of the sponsor, but if you're a foreign manufacturer, i.e. not based in Australia, you must appoint a sponsor. All applications for ARTG inclusions and everything happens in the Australian e-business portal, or the EBS, and the Australian sponsor does all that on your behalf. Now, this is a rather uncatchy technical definition of the Australian sponsor. You may read it if you wish, but essentially what it means is if you're not based in Australia, you have to appoint an entity in Australia, a legal entity in Australia. So it's essentially the same as in Europe. In Europe, you have to appoint an EC representative if you're not based in a member state of the European Union, of course. So what does the Australian sponsor do? Essentially, the Australian sponsor is a liaison between the TGA and the manufacturer. Okay, so the sponsor is responsible for obtaining the information requested by the TGA and providing that information within the legislative timeframes. Critically, the sponsor is responsible for ensuring that the manufacturer complies to the essential principles commensurate to the risk class of the device that you're applying for for market authorization in Australia. And the way they do that is by having, or access to the technical documentation as well as certification that the manufacturer may hold. There's a whole bunch of post-market surveillance responsibilities, but I've extracted that and put it in its own slide a little bit further into this presentation because it's a real significant portion of the responsibilities that the Australian sponsor has. But in short, it's a liaison, a go-between, if you will, between the manufacturer and the TGA. Okay, so an ARTG application summary, essentially your market authorization summary. This is, I guess you can call it a flow chart. I'm not very good at putting slides together that have fancy flow charts and graphs and things on them, but this does the job. The very first step, of course, is determining the risk classification according to local regulatory definitions. Now, the risk classifications has been aligned quite closely to the European requirements, but there are differences. It's not completely aligned. So it's important that you classify your device according to the Australian regulatory definitions. The next step, if you're an Australian sponsor, if you're outside of Australia, appoint your sponsor and provide the sponsor with all the technical documentation and evidence of conformity to the essential principles. Once the sponsor is satisfied with the documentation they've received, they submit for what's known as a manufacturer evidence identifier. Now, that's not applicable to certain Class 1 devices, and I'll talk about that as we go through the presentation today. The goal of the manufacturer evidence identifier is to then link to your application for your ARTG inclusion. Okay. Once the TGA has performed their conformity assessment, you will get your TGA approval, you'll pay your fees, you pay your annual fees, and your post-market surveillance responsibilities begin. Okay, so there's different ways of demonstrating conformity to get yourselves on the ARTG. And again, I'm going to disregard Class 1s for now, and I'll talk about that separately. You can get a conformity assessment certificate from the TGA. Like I said, I'm not going to go into detail on this today, but feel free to ask. Up till 2021, certain risk classes of devices were mandatory requirement to have a TGA conformity assessment certificate. They were particularly high risk classes like Class 4 IVDs or devices that had animal tissue or human origin. But because of the MDR and the alignment to the classification process, alignment to the MDR, they figured that the European regulations have now increased the scrutiny on their devices, including clinical evidence and demonstrations to the GSPR, that they can rely more heavily on MDR certificates and IVDR certificates and not force manufacturers to have a conformity assessment certificate from the TGA specifically. But it may still be required depending on whether or not you have suitable overseas certification. Okay. You can apply for an abridged application. If you have certifications from overseas regulators, you can use that abridged application for a TGA conformity assessment certificate or for an ARTG inclusion directly. It's a very popular choice, of course. Why would you want the TGA come into your house if you don't have to have them there, if you're able to demonstrate compliance through other means? The vast majority of manufacturers do choose that route, and that's what we're going to focus on today. A more recent something that the TGA not too long ago introduced was conformity assessment from an Australian corporation, and it's exactly how it sounds. You're an Australian business corporation. If you demonstrate the pre-requirements, if you can demonstrate the prerequisites and you demonstrate that you're capable, you can become essentially a notified body in Australia and do conformity assessments. But we're not going to talk about that today in too much detail. There's not enough time. Okay, so risk classifications, very important first step in your journey towards market authorization. Like I said, in 2021, the risk classifications were aligned, not entirely, but substantially, with the EU MDR classification. So you'll recognize class 1 through class 3. This is based on the intended purpose of the device and the invasiveness of the device. So, for example, your lowest risk class that are not provided sterile or don't have a measuring function, or things like your surgical retractors. Okay. This is governed by Schedule 2 of the regulation. And by the regulation, I mean the Medical Device Regulation 2002. Very handily, the TGA has put together a grouping system, which there's a tool on the TGA website you can use where they have predefined risk classes, groups A through E. For example, Group B are breast implants, joint replacement implants, contraceptives, active implantable devices, and these are your class 3 devices, all the way down to Group E, which are class 1 devices, and they're like devices used for cleaning other devices. So it's a very handy tool. And all manufacturers seeking market authorization in Australia should follow this tool online and do not automatically assume your EU MDR classification is the same as the Australian classification. Likewise for the IVDs, you'll see obviously that the risk classes here are 1 through 4, which differs from the IVDR. The IVDR is A through D. Class 4 IVDs in Australia are your highest public risk. Similar again to the IVDR in that, the devices used for blood screening for HIV, for example, have the highest public risk and therefore the highest risk classification IVD. As always, risk classification is based on the specific intended purpose of the device. And the golden rule is the higher the risk an incorrect result would pose, the higher the risk classification. Now, the TGA have introduced a rule-based approach, again, similar to the IVDR, if you're familiar with the IVDR. It's rules 1.1a and b all the way through to 1.8. Okay, so again, on the TGA website, they do have this guidance tool to appropriately risk class your IVD. Once you've identified the risk class of your device, you then look at what's going to be the applicable essential principles. And it's the sponsor, as I said, that has the responsibility to gather the objective evidence from the manufacturer to demonstrate compliance to the Australian TGA essential principles. Now, they are Australian TGA essential principles on an Australian TGA essential principles checklist. The most up-to-date checklist you can find on the TGA website. I will say that right now there is a reform going through the process to align the essential principles of the TGA more closely to the GSPR of the European Union, so the MDR and IVDR GSPRs. I believe that consultation went out to key stakeholders consult in August of last year, and it closed in November of last year. And I did see the proposal. There's quite considerable alignment between the two. I believe if you watch this space, we're going to see that the TGA essential principles are going to align quite soon with the GSPR of Europe. But as it stands, you've got your 6 general principles, and then your device-specific principles 7 through 15, including principle 15, which is principles applying specifically to IVDs. So I'm sure this essential principles checklist will look quite familiar to the regulatory personnel on this call. And you can see that they do differ at the moment to the GSPR, not only in structure, but I find the GSPR is far more specific on requirements, particularly around clinical evidence, state-of-the-art, and risk management and post-market surveillance, whereas the TGA is a little bit more general. But again, I think if you're compliant to the European GSPRs, they transcribe very well to the TGA essential principles, but you do need to fill in the TGA essential principles checklist. Okay, and it's the sponsor that has the responsibility of ensuring conformity. Now, you'll remember that I've kind of glossed over class 1 devices to a degree, and this is why. Class 1 IVD medical devices, which are not self-testing devices and not point-of-care devices, they are self-declared. Okay, so you don't need manufacturer evidence for these devices. You need a declaration of conformity, and you can apply for the ARTG inclusion directly. And you can get that done in, oh, I think it's about 4 business days, so long as everything aligns. Likewise, for the class 1 medical devices that don't have a measuring function and are not sterile, you supply the declaration of conformity. But that's not to say that, you submit your declaration of conformity and that's the end of it. The TGA can at any time request supplemental documentation. And normally for class 1s, it's like the IFU, advertising material, to make sure that your device truly is a class 1 IVD or a class 1 medical device. Okay, so the sponsor still has the responsibility for ensuring that they have all of that information on hand. Manufacturer's evidence. So for all higher risk classifications, so class 1 sterile and above, the sponsor must obtain a manufacturer evidence identifier to later link to an ARTG market authorization application. Now, essentially, your manufacturer's evidence is evidence for the facility quality management system compliance. Okay. Now, the way the sponsor gets that identifier is they apply through the TGA portal, and they supply either a TGA conformity assessment certificate or an acceptable overseas market authorization or quality management certificate or the declaration of conformity. And as I said, class 1 devices don't need any additional manufacturer evidence identifiers. Now, it's important to remember that you can only have one identifier per manufacturer, so you really have to work with your sponsor or your manufacturer to assess what devices you're actually going to want to apply for market authorization, and make sure that you have a suitable level of certification to cover those devices. And I'll talk about that a little bit further. Okay, utilizing overseas certification, something that makes the TGA very popular. So the TGA does recognize and relies on, to a degree. I think the last I heard, this might be a little bit incorrect, but it's ballpark figure. About 90% of ARTG medical device and IVDs utilize overseas certification. Again, I can't remember where I heard that or read that, but it's something that's stuck in my head. And I think the vast majority of those rely on CE marked devices. Now, that makes sense. I mean, the European Union, for a long time, prior to the MDR and IVDR, was considered quite an easy market to get to. And that reasoning was that the vast majority of devices, particularly IVDs, required no notified body pre-market approval. There was a lot of self-declaration, and that was, you were allowed to use that evidence in Australia. And I think that it's still the case that CE marked devices are going to be very popular. As you can see, the alignment between the TGA conformity, TGA regulations and the European regulations, but also the amount of weight that the TGA puts behind an MDR certificate or an IVDR certificate. So that's not going to change. Okay, so I think that, FDA, yes, but certainly CE marked or CE certificates carry the most weight in Australia. So what specific evidence and documentation do the TGA actually consider? So they consider certificates issued by notified bodies under the medical device frameworks, and that's the directives and the regulations. They still do accept medical device certificates from the MDDD and the IVDD. There's transition provisions and conditions, of course, and I cover that in a couple of slides. They do accept pre-market approval and 510(k) decisions by the US FDA, approvals and medical device licenses from Health Canada. Now, if you remember, medical device licenses are for higher risk class devices in Canada. I think it's class 2 to class 4. So that still carries a lot of weight with the TGA. Pre-market approvals or certification from Japan, so the MHLW or the PMDA. Registrations and approvals of the Singapore Health Sciences Authority is an acceptable form of evidence. And they still accept ISO 5 certificates issued by a certification body that's also a notified body. So I have come across certificates in Europe that were issued by companies and not notified bodies. They're not accepted, but if it's a notified body, they are accepted. But obviously still within the timeframes of the IVDD to IVDR transition provisions, and likewise for the medical device transition provisions. And you must also supplement your ISO 13485 certificate evidence with transition provision certificate conditions. So demonstrate that you've committed to the MDR or the IVDR. So medical device single audit program certificates. This is a very useful program for market access in Australia. It's not mandatory in terms of, like Health Canada, they require you that you must have mandatory MDSAP certificates if you want to supply devices in Canada. Not the case in Australia, but in Australia, what they do mandate is that if you do have a TGA certificate, a MDSAP certificate, and you want to use it in Australia, then you have to have the Australian requirements in the scope of your MDSAP certificate, which makes sense, of course. And the MDSAP certificates are very good manufacturer's evidence for compliance of the quality management system. So I do encourage manufacturers based outside of Australia to consider the MDSAP program, which it's a burdensome audit to go through, but it's better than having multiple audits. So your overseas evidence can be used in different ways. It can be used for your ARTG application directly, and it depends on the category and the classification of the medical device. So the sponsors has to choose in liaison with the manufacturers what's the most suitable overseas certificate they can use. Now, it can be used as manufacturer evidence required for your higher level risk classes, and also evidence of product assessment. So when you apply for your manufacturer evidence, like I said, it's mostly quality management system compliance. And then when you link that manufacturer evidence to your ARTG application, you must also supply documents that demonstrate your product assessment. So that's not just QMS, but also your product assessment. Now, there's a very good, it can get a little bit complicated, and there's a very good guidance that the TGA have released, and it's been updated just recently, I think even at the start of this year, that provides you different scenarios. So, for example, if you rely on an FDA product assessment, you need to supply an MDSAP certificate as your manufacturer's evidence. Okay. Whereas if you have an IVDR or MDR QMS certificate under Annex 9, Chapter 1, you supply that as manufacturer evidence, then you supply the report that the notified body will provide you when they've reviewed your technical documentation and they've reviewed your performance evaluation or your clinical evaluation. You provide that report as your evidence of product assessment, and that is suitable. So, like I say, this can get quite complicated, and there's very particular like formats, a very particular order of things that you can supply. So please reach out to me or go directly to the TGA website if you'd like some more clarity on what you can use for manufactured evidence versus evidence of a product assessment. But the important point to remember is manufacturer evidence, QMS, and evidence of product assessment is the product review. So what impact has the MDR and the IVDR had? Well, like I've said numerous times now, the TGA very much likes the MDR and the IVDR, and there's a lot of reform going on right now, and there has been reform to align more closely to the regulations. It's had a ripple effect in Australia, and primarily because of like the impact the MDR and the IVDR has had in Europe, and that there's been unexpected extensions and of rollouts of conformity requirements, particular transition provisions, conditions, limited notified bodies, etc. So it has had a knock-on effect in Australia, but nevertheless, it has resulted in streamlined processes in Australia. You can reduce application fees if you have European Medical Device Regulation or IVDR certificates, and the classifications of devices have aligned mostly. And the TGA will go on continue to rely heavily on EU approvals for ARTG assessments. And the good news is the TGA has also accepted the transition provisions of the MDR and IVDR, and is facilitating that. But it does have an impact. If you have already got an ARTG inclusion, you've already got a device approved in Australia, or you're looking to seek market authorization in Australia, the MDR and IVDR has impacted your strategy. And let me talk about that a little bit here. So, like I said, the TGA will continue to accept MDD and IVDD certificates, accompanied by evidence of your commitment to go to the MDR and IVDR and within line with the transition provision timelines. However, many manufacturers may have already transitioned to the EU MDR and have used their previous medical device certificate under the MDDD as their conformity assessment certificate. If that's the case, you have to change your existing evidence that you've supplied to the TGA. In addition, the MDR and IVDR has resulted in manufacturers having to change device classifications, for example, or change the scope of their intended purpose, or reduce the indications, increase the contraindications, change the functional descriptions, update the label and instructions for use. So these are all documents and information that you will have supplied the TGA when you first got your device on the market. Now they're no longer applicable. So sponsors has to modify manufacturer evidence, and they're supposed to do that within 60 days of identifying that what's already with the TGA is no longer applicable to the device. So in this slide, I'll show you some examples. Okay, so if you've got a new MDR certificate, you have to make a variation, manufacturer's evidence variation. Okay, that's quite simple to do. It's done through the EBS platform, and you submit a DCR, device change request. However, if you've got a change to your device classification due to the MDR or IVDR, you need to lodge a new application for inclusion all over again. And I won't go through these one by one, but you can see that there's a few conditions and likely scenarios that the MDR or IVDR has impacted your device that's already approved in Australia based on existing evidence from Europe. So it's well worth, if you already have market approval here, it's well worth assessing the documentation that you've provided the TGA and work with your sponsor to rectify that as soon as possible. Okay. Continuing the theme of aligning with the European regulations, clinical evidence. Clinical evidence, there are legislative requirements, of course, for Australia, which you have to fulfill. However, it's still safe to say that the clinical evidence requirements is comparable, to the MDR, IVDR, and even the FDA. But your clinical evidence will be reviewed at some point. Okay, so it can either be reviewed through your application process or through an application audit or an audit at any point. The TGA reserves the right to request the technical documentation from you at any point. So I strongly advise to refer to these two guidance documents, the clinical evidence guidance for medical devices of 2023 and the supplemental guidance for the IVD devices. And some of the legislative requirements here relate to the essential principles, essential principle 14, for example, and essential principles 1, 3, and 6. So Schedule 1 and Schedule 3 of the regulation is the point of reference here. So the clinical evaluation process. So what are the TGA looking for? So as per Part 8 of Schedule 3, manufacturers must obtain and evaluate clinical data in the form of clinical investigation data and or literature review. So this is, again, very similar to the European framework. They also expect to see your preclinical studies. And when it relating to IVD documents, scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance, are all documents that you can supply directly to the TGA without renaming them, under the TGA. You're supposed to have a clinical evaluation report even for IVDs. However, so long as you're, and this comes back to the objective or the outcome-based approach of the TGA, so long as your clinical evidence that you've generated in Europe demonstrates conformity to the essential principles of the TGA, it will be accepted. Okay. Same requirements, as Europe. Clinical evidence must be generated in accordance with state-of-the-art standards, such as 14971 for risk management, 14155 or 21916 for clinical studies using samples from human origin. And clinical evidence is required to be submitted upon application, but also kept up to date, again, similar to the MDR and IVDR, keeping your clinical evidence up to date throughout the life cycle of the device. And that is similar again through IVDR and MDR, common theme, through the post-market performance follow-up process and post-market clinical follow-up processes. So you update your CER regularly or in line with your requirements annually. The clinical evaluation report is the critical document in this regard, and there's very good guidance that the TGA provides on the content for your CER. Now, I could talk for hours on clinical evidence requirements and how to demonstrate clinical evidence, but I have very limited time today. So, please use the guidance documents available. But the golden rule is the MDR and the IVDR do, the requirements are pretty similar in terms of the amount of evidence that you need to generate. Okay. So the ARTG application audit. So the TGA has a right to audit your application. And this is based on, the type of device that it is, the risk classification of the device, and also in some cases, the source of the conformity assessment certificate. So whether it's a ISO 13485 certificate, for example, or a medical device directive certificate. And these audits are typically desktop audits where they request your clinical evidence or your IFU, your essential principle, everything that you have generated to demonstrate conformity to the essential principles of the TGA. And some applications, unfortunately, have a mandatory application audit, and this was expanded upon in 2021. So when they did reclassification or alignment reform with the MDR and IVDR, they increased the scope of what it has to be considered for a mandatory TGA audit. And I should say that these application audits do come at quite significant expense. I think the last one I was part of was approximately 17,000 Australian dollars. But, if your device meets the classifications listed here, so whether you have a class 3 medical device supported by, like I said, a medical device directive certificate, or a device supported by MDSAP and an FDA 510K clearance, or any one of those IVDs, class 3 or class 4, then you will be subject to an application audit. So you have to consider that cost ahead of time. And please also ensure that you do have the documentation on hand to try and speed up the process. You don't want to have to be generating documentation once you get the questions from the TGA. And to be honest, the sponsor should already have made sure that you're in conformance with the essential principles commensurate to the risk class of your device. So please keep that in mind. You will be subject to an audit if you're one of these risk classifications, but the TGA can audit any application they see fit. Okay. Now, clinical trials in Australia. Every regulatory or every territory or country around the world has their own requirements for clinical trials. Okay, so Australia is no different. Australia, if you're going to use an unapproved therapeutic goods, and an unapproved therapeutic goods is any one of those definitions in the bullet points, so the one that's applicable to us is any medical device not entered in the ARTG, or even if it is on the ARTG, but you're done some new design specifications or changes to the device, it's not covered by your ARTG application or inclusion. it's considered an unapproved therapeutic good. If it's an unapproved therapeutic good, you either have to go through one of two schemes. So the clinical trial notification, the CTN, or the clinical trial approval, CTA scheme. Okay. And I'll talk about the differences between those in the next slide. So prior to initiating any clinical trial in Australia, you have to first consult with the Human Research Ethics Committee, HREC, and that includes whether you're using, say, leftover de-identified samples that were used for another study. It's not the samples that are the trigger here. It's the use of an unapproved therapeutic good. Okay. Clinical trials are regulated, unfortunately, at the Commonwealth, state, and territory level, so it's not altogether harmonized depending on which state you are in Australia. Whether you use a CTN or a CTA is up to the clinical trial sponsor based in Australia, but also in consult with the HREC. Okay. Now, for novel devices, novel medical devices, new analytes, new technology, or any high-risk devices that might put study participants at risk, your most likely route is going to be your CTA route, which is quite an expensive and timely route because that requires quite a lot of detailed evaluations and your study plans, etc. So a more preferable and advantageous route is the CTN, which is just a notification scheme. So that's notifying of the intent to run the clinical trial and then, providing updates of the clinical trial, but it's relatively cheap and the TGA is not really involved. Well, they have minimal involvement. So that's definitely the more attractive of the options in Australia. So, as per other markets in the world, there are some advantages and disadvantages in comparison to other territories. So if you take the European Union, for example, the European Union has done a good job in harmonizing across the member states and only having to apply to one competent authority, to the UDAMED system, and that's up and running. But in the FDA, it's all governed by the FDA and the IRB. There's a lot of experience of clinical trials in the US, so it can be quite a good option for manufacturers. In Australia, yes, so if you can get the CTN route, then you're in a good position. The CTA, there's benefits to it. Of course, it's a very detailed evaluation. There's very good reviews, and it provides you with excellent data in that regard, but it can be costly and it can take a while to get done. So, depending on the target population of your device, you may need to run studies in Australia. Okay, so if the target population is particular ethnic background, you might have to run a trial in Australia. Okay, so there's a lot to consider around clinical trials, and there's a very good clinical trial handbook which the TGA have created, which goes into a lot of details about the different requirements for clinical trials in Australia. Okay, so once you're happy and you've got your device approved and on the ARTG database, and you've got your device, ready to go, the post-market surveillance of the TGA kicks in. Of course, so similar to, the European Union again, you don't just get your device on the market and then forget about it. The TGA will carry out inspections to ensure that clinical evidence is being modified and kept up to date and is still in compliance with the essential principles. They can inspect the quality management system. Now, this can be done directly by the TGA or done through an EU notified body. Okay, so it depends on which manufacturer evidence you've supplied relating to your quality management system. But this is where the MDSAP certificate has a lot of merit because it does cover the TGA requirements and will prevent the TGA most likely from coming to your facility. Post-market surveillance obligations of the sponsor and manufacturers. So of course there's vigilance requirements. So that's reporting of adverse incidents or any overseas regulatory actions that also impact the devices you have on the market in Australia. You conduct your adverse event vigilance reporting through the portal. So the sponsor will do this. In fact, manufacturers can actually do it directly if it's a serious adverse event. But you do have to make sure that you have compliant processes in place to ensure that you've defined an adverse event in serious incidents, etc., in according to TGA requirements. And it's very important that Australian sponsors also have these procedures in place. Okay, so when it comes part if you're a manufacturer outside of Australia and you're appointing a sponsor, one of the key elements of control is having a sponsor agreement in place. And that sponsor agreement should be very clear on the obligations of the manufacturer and the obligations of the sponsor. And a critical element of that is ensuring that the sponsor has the infrastructure in place to make the vigilance reporting in accordance with the TGA timeframes. And there are annual reporting requirements. This is only for particular devices. So if it's an implantable class 2B or a class 3 or active implantable medical device or a class 4 IVD, you are required to provide 3 consecutive annual reports to the TGA. Now, this is done via your sponsor and done via email in this regard. This is one of the things that's not done through the portal. So they're looking for a report that covers things like, number of complaints that you've received, the number of complaints originating from Australia, number of adverse events, number of overseas issues. So there's a whole list of requirements that you have to fulfill in your annual reporting. And that has to be done for the first 3 years after your ARTG approval. Okay, I'm running out of time. So my final slide today, just to summarize, okay, so the TGA, the Australian market is still a very attractive market for medical devices and IVDs for a number of reasons, but, a big component of that is the fact that you can utilize overseas certification as evidence of conformity for your devices. The TGA requirements are aligning very closely to the EU MDR and IVDR, and that will continue over the coming months. And as things change and evolve in Europe, I'm sure they will change and evolve here too. Clinical evidence expectations are mostly harmonized, which is beneficial. So if you're demonstrating clinical evidence in in Europe, you can use that here in Australia. So I hope I managed to cover most interesting points for everybody here. I think we've got some time for questions, but if we don't have time to get to these questions, I will be happy to answer any emails that you may have, and I'll end my slideshow there. So I think I stop sharing, do I?
Yeah, you should be good, I think. Thank
Um,
you so much, Lee. That was such valuable information. And we do have a lot of questions. I'm going to start
yeah,
asking a few. I know that we're not going to be able to get through all of these, so we will make sure to answer all of your questions. Lee will, or we have an in-house expert that was answering some of the questions and typing them back in the chat. So hopefully you're getting some of those answered. Jody Granger has just started with us in the last month, so we're super excited to have her on board, and she's an expert that's answering some of the questions as we go. So Lee,
good.
one of the first questions, what fees are associated with ARTG applications and what ongoing costs are there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there's a full list of of fees that the TGA have introduced, and they review that every year, and that can be found on the TGA website directly. But as a ballpark figure, your annual charges, it's kind of depending on the risk class of the device. For example, a class 3 device, your annual charge is going to be about 1,500 Australian dollars. It differs for IVDs, of course, and I think I mentioned that if you're subject to an ARTG application audit, that can be a significant cost. That was a big jump from years 2023 to 2024. So we did see, I don't have it off the top of my head exactly, but I think it was around 17,000 Australian dollars for a class 3 IVD device for an ARTG application. So yes, there's fees for your application, which is usually very minimal, nothing quite, you don't have to break the bank to do that, and then you have ongoing annual fees. But if you do go down that audit application audit, it can get quite expensive.
Okay, perfect. And then is there an emphasis on cybersecurity for medical devices as we have seen in Europe?
Yes, that's a very good point, actually. So in 2021, when they did some reclassification of the medical device classifications, and we've seen, recently some MDCG guidance in Europe, specifically around cybersecurity. Now, I can't remember the MDCG guidance off the top of my head, but there are cybersecurity requirements for Australian devices, and they're covered by certain essential principles. So if you use state-of-the-art standards like 62304 for the development of software, that gets you to consider all your requirements. That's considered state of the art, and that gets you to consider cybersecurity. But what I would recommend to users is to look at the MDCG guidance in Europe around cybersecurity, and if you follow that for your medical devices here, you're going to do pretty well with your conformity to your essential principles that consider cybersecurity. And there are guidances on the TGA website specific to cybersecurity as well. And it's about taking into consideration cybersecurity through the risk management of the device and the development of the device and usability engineering and things of that nature. So yeah, absolutely, there is a focus on cybersecurity, and manufacturers will do very well to take that into consideration when they're developing a device.
Okay. And again, we're not going to be able to get to all these questions. We have so many coming in. How about if you are registered in Australia using the CE mark route under MDD and decide to withdraw your product from the EU market while preparing for the EU MDR transition, does the TGA require you to resubmit using an alternative route?
Do you want me to give you the correct answer or the sneaky answer?
You decide. You know this market better than me.
If you cancel well, it depends if your certificate is still valid. So you can withdraw your product in Europe, but if you're withdrawing the product off your certificate in Europe, then technically speaking, your sponsor has 60 days to amend the manufacturer's evidence in Australia. Otherwise, yes, you should also withdraw your ARTG inclusion or modify your manufacturer's evidence.
Okay. Regarding adding the TGA requirements to the scope of the medical device single audit program, the MDSAP, you
Yeah.
might say that differently, I don't know, certificate, what challenges can manufacturers expect?
Yeah, so if you have an MDSAP certificate, that's how I say it, MDSAP,
Okay.
then you'll follow the audit checklist. Okay, so the audit handbook, and it does spell out the specific TGA requirements. But the majority of the additional requirements that your QMS would have to demonstrate are around vigilance. So ensuring that your vigilance considers the TGA requirements, your control over your sponsor, making sure you have a sponsor certificate if you're a non-Australian manufacturer. In that sponsor agreement, sorry, not certificate, your sponsor agreement covers all the obligations that the sponsor, which I ran through earlier, the sponsor has on behalf of the manufacturer. There's also things like process validation, specific requirements for the TGA, and also, technical, clinical evidence, ensuring that your clinical evidence is kept up to date in compliance with state-of-the-art standards. So it's not a big leap. If you have FDA and you have ISO 13485, I don't think it's a considerable undertaking to do, but you do have to be careful and make sure that you utilize the MDSAP audit checklist when you're getting ready for your audit.
Okay, I'm going to try to do one more question so we can end right on time. So what's the difference between Therapeutic Goods Medical Devices Regulation 2002 and Therapeutic Goods Act of 1989, and are they used together?
Yeah, so the act is the overall legislative framework for all therapeutic goods in Australia, and the Therapeutic Goods Act, the Medical Devices 2002, sorry, not Act, Regulation 2002, is specific to medical devices, and by complying to that regulation, you're going to comply to the requirements of medical devices of the Therapeutic Act of 1989.
All right,
So
perfect.
compliance to both is the short answer.
Okay, and like I said, we have so many more questions that we weren't able to get to. Lee, I appreciate your time so much. I know that it's late for you there, so we appreciate you staying up to talk to us today. And then for all the other questions, we will address all those and reach out to you guys and make sure that we answer all of those. And then Jody, thank you for working in the background to answer some of those questions as we go along. And we appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much. Have a
Thank
good day.
you.
Bye.
Thanks very much.